Okay, as I was saying, the Great Smoky Mountains streams were once sort of interconnected. And as the mountains started becoming eroded, the streams were divided. And before that happened, there were a group of salamanders that lived in those streams. And as the ridges and valleys were formed by water rolling off the mountains and creating these other streams, the bigger population of salamanders became restricted to those streams. And now, if you go up there and collect salamanders from the different streams, there's basically one species of salamander per stream because they were all cut off, they were all reproductively isolated, and they then all had to adjust, and the gene pools had to change over time to meet, to fit the survivability of each specific stream. Maybe each stream had different predators, maybe certain alleles were selected for through sexual selection, whatever it might be. Once they were cut off, each individual smaller population were under the same evolutionary forces that we've been talking about. Okay, now the other one that's a little bit harder to understand is called sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is when you have a population that remains in the same area, so it's not being cut off by geography, but something about certain areas of those organisms in that population become isolated from each other due to different mechanisms. So you get these little pockets of reproductive isolation within the population. So if you look at this picture over here, we have our original population, and then there's some sort of variation in color or something about the organism, which we call a polymorphism. But that polymorphism just isn't a difference in color or something that doesn't matter. In effect, it's so strong that it causes only those who have that polymorphism to reproduce with others that have that polymorphism, so that's effectively isolating them from the larger population. One really good example of this is in plants. You can sometimes have different rules with plants for reproduction, and you can have more than one pollen grain, which is, has the sperm in it, fertilizing an ovary. So you get a condition sometimes where you have more than two chromosomes, and this is called polyploidy. And once polyploidy happens in an area where there are plants, it could be as simple as your front yard. Those polyploid plants now, because they now have 4 sets of chromosomes per cell and not 2 for each trait. Or I'm sorry, let me back up. They have so the polyploidy, usually you inherit 1 set of DNA from each parent, but now they have more than that. So what I'm getting at is the polyploid plants are only able to breed with other polyploids. And what that does is it automatically makes them reproductively isolated from the rest of the group. So as they arise and start reproducing, they represent the subset of reproductive isolation within the larger population. And if given time, if these rules are not flexible at all, they may be considered new species in the future. Okay, this is just a little chart showing the original population. And there's a little barrier here. And let's say that over time, maybe there's a drought one year and some of this water becomes evaporated, or it just becomes, so we're not having runoff, but we're having evaporation. It effectively cuts off one part of the population from the other. And for whatever reason, we can go with something simple like sexual selection. Maybe the bluish-green coloration is selected for over and over and over again. Whereas over here, there's, for some reason, maybe in this case, maybe it's camouflage. The brown phenotype is selected for. Well, if given enough time, these two groups may become reproductively isolated from each other. And if you took this barrier away, because they look different and maybe behave different, or maybe they eat different things in this area than they did when they were once together. They may not know each other anymore, and they may not ever breed together. So effectively, initially they're cut off because they don't recognize each other, but then that isolation is strengthened over time because they're not reproducing with each other. So initially, all it might take is a phenotypic change where they don't recognize each other, and then the difference just gets solidified over time to where they're only breeding within their own group because of that geography, and they're getting less and less similar, so that if you took the barrier away, they wouldn't recognize each other. On the other hand, here you have sympatric speciation example, where the water level is just fine, but for some reason or another, you have pockets of different phenotypes that are becoming prevalent in this group, and maybe for some reason these bluish fish are only choosing to breed with other bluefish. And so they effectively reproductively isolate themselves from the rest of the population, and over time, possibly, if these fish don't recognize each other anymore as being potential breeding partners, they could be considered new species. All right, so if you look at how isolation impacts organisms, it doesn't always result in speciation. There are several outcomes that can happen following isolation. So depending on the circumstances, hybrid populations can emerge along the way between isolated populations. So if you think about it in terms of a range, almost like a Venn diagram where you have overlap between different subsets of the original species, wherever you have that overlap, you may have hybridization. And so even though on the edges, let's say the Venn diagram, there are total differences in that in those two groups, where they overlap, you get hybridization, where they're still able to breed a little bit. They're not totally isolated from each other. One of the ideas of this is called a ring species. In a ring species, you can start off with an ancestral population, and as these populations move about, what you end up with is isolation of different populations as they migrate. Maybe one migrates to another area because of competition of food or something like that. But between these small populations, there's enough gene flow where you have hybridization that you totally don't lose the species. But as distance increases and there's less hybridization between the two, eventually you get to a number 7 down here, you get to a population that is very different from the first population. So these two together maybe not breed together because they don't know each other, and they may be genetically distinct from each other. But along the way, you might find enough overlap where hybridization is taking place. Here's a really good example of that. It's actually in your homework, but I'm going to go ahead and play it for you now, and you can sort of follow the ring species of these salamanders.
Salamander found in California. Now meet another, and another. These salamanders are members of the same species, so why do they look and behave so differently? In California, populations of these salamanders became separated geographically, evolving over millions of years to adapt to different environments. They've changed so much that they are on their way to becoming entirely separate species. David Wake of the University of California, Berkeley explains.
The history of this species complex began about 10 million years ago in the ancient redwood forests of northern California, where we have today this form picta, which is highly variable both genetically and in terms of coloration. There were 2 migratory routes followed by animals as they moved into southern California. One along the Sierra Nevada mountain chain, where animals moved into the forested region, the other along the coastal mountains. They avoided the Great Central Valley.
The populations that gradually moved down the forested region of California relied on blending in with their environment. Animals with good camouflage tended to survive more and produce offspring with similar traits. As the salamanders progressed south over millions of years, the markings became more distinct.
At the end of the chain in Southern California, we have this form claveri, which is the extreme of variation, showing the largest blotches, most bold marking. These were all then camouflaged organisms that were hiding from predators. Along the coast, a different strategy was followed. Here, the organisms adopted the color pattern and behavior of dangerously poisonous newts, and they became, instead of camouflage, they were advertising their resemblance to these dangerously poisonous animals and gaining an advantage because of their mimicry. So what happened is that you had two differently adapted lineages moving to the south, and by the time they reached the southern end, they had essentially evolved into different species. But at certain areas, for example, in the Palomar Mountain area in San Diego County, we get these animals, which are hybrids, and the hybrids are neither similar to the dangerously poisonous animals, they're not good mimics, nor are they good animals in terms of camouflage. So these organisms are essentially dead ends.
These hybrid offspring are not well adapted to their environment and are therefore less likely to survive. The two parent subspecies that produce the hybrids are well on their way to becoming entirely separate species, evolving just as Darwin described in his theory of evolution.
I think Darwin would love this example because it shows exactly the sorts of patterns that he was talking about. Gradual adaptive divergence, leading eventually to the establishment of new species.
Okay, so if you, in that salamander example then, so we had the divergence from the ancestral population in Northern California. And in this case, we had hybridization along the way. So there was some gene flow, but they took two different paths. One took the path of toxicity, or the mimicry of toxicity. One took the path where they were being more camouflage. And eventually they met on the other side. And along the way, there's some hybridization because time-wise, there hasn't been enough time for them to be totally isolated from each other genetically. And so you may end up having eventually two totally distinct species with a little bit of hybridization, maybe not much, because there's no advantage to that, right? In other situations, not the salamanders, you could actually have them come back and become another population, but just different from the original population, or they could actually maintain this duality with hybridization in the middle. So isolation can have different effects. In the case of the salamanders, or in case of this ring species down here, they eventually will produce new species. All right, so there are some barriers to speciation that are really important. And so if we look at nature, nature puts up barriers so that species can be distinct from each other. So successful reproduction equals reproduction of fertile offspring. So the barriers that are in place that relate to fertilization are those that come before fertilization or before a zygote is formed, and those that come after a zygote is formed or after fertilization. So, and there are a lot of them, but they are divided into the prezygotic and the postzygotic. If you look at this chart, this is showing you individuals of different species and why they can't mix together. Even if they attempt to mate, these barriers keep them apart. So probably the most obvious one is if you are not in the same habitat, then there's no way for you to mate. So that would prevent you from mating. If you are two species and um, you are not around at the same time. So you're coming out at night to feed while the other one is during the day, or your breeding time is in the fall, but the other is in the spring, or maybe you only, like cicadas, you only come out of the ground every 7 years, but the other cicadas come out every 15, then you're really preventing any sort of relationship to form because of time. Behavioral, any sort of unique rituals or mating dances or colorations or calls may not be understood. So those things, when they're flashed to each other, they may not be able to recognize each other. Reproductive anatomy. You just may not have the equipment to try to breed. So even if you try to breed, you attempt to mate, you may be isolated because of your equipment. And you can use your imagination for this. But if you look at these snails down here, if the curling of the shell goes in the opposite direction, then your genitals are on the wrong side, so you can't copulate. So this snail's genitals are on one side, and the other ones are on the other side of the body. So even if they try to get together to mate, there's no way to do it. And then also gametic isolation. The gametes, sperm and egg, have specific surface proteins on the outside of them. And if those don't match up, like locks and keys, then fusion of sperm and egg won't take place. Sperm won't be allowed to penetrate the egg. So two different species, even if mating does happen, and sperm and egg are in contact with each other, if they're not the same in terms of their protein coatings, then you're not going to have any sort of fertilization. So if all of this doesn't fail, then, and there actually is fertilization that takes place between two organisms that don't seem like the same species, there are other barriers to keep them apart. And these are what we call the postzygotic barriers. And so if mating does take place, or what we call hybridization, the first thing we would have is reduced hybrid viability. So just like in that salamander you saw in the video just a little while ago, the hybrids of those two that came from the coast and came from the mountains are weak, and they're not good mimics, they're not good at camouflage, they're really not very healthy. So eventually they're either not going to be born at all, or they will break down very soon after they are born. Probably the one that people know the most is the idea that hybrids can be sterile. So here we have a horse and a donkey, and we can get a mule from that. So reduced hybrid fertility means that the product of these two is sterile, and it's a dead end reproductively. It can't backbreed to either of these. And then lastly, even if there is a hybrid that's able to breed back with one of these two types of parents, if that does happen and they do have offspring, then that offspring is usually very poor in terms of its genetic capability, and it will break down. It won't live to reproduce again. So all of these are barriers to speciation that occur to keep species apart from each other. And as you review these, you can probably think of good examples yourself of how this would work. So I'm going to stop the Prezi here because this is how far I got in third period. So if you have any questions, please ask me tomorrow in class.